Of course, here is part 1, written according to your specifications. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. The piano key felt cold and hard under her finger, like a smooth, white tombstone. For a long moment, that was all she could feel, that one point of cold contact. The grand concert hall, with its velvet seats and golden carvings, seemed to suck all the air out of the room. The only sound was the frantic drumming of her own heart in her ears, a wild, terrified rhythm that had nothing to do with the carefully prepared piece of music. Waiting in her mind, she was 16 years old, and this was her final audition for the prestigious Whitaker Conservatory. It was the kind of place that didn't just teach music, it polished future stars. For years, her life had been a tight circle of school, practice, and sleep, all orbiting the single goal. Her parents had sacrificed, driving her to lessons, investing in a better piano. Their quiet hopes as heavy as the suitcase full of sheet music she carried. She took a shaky breath, the kind that doesn't really reach your lungs, and placed her hands in the starting position. The opening chords of Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata were supposed to be powerful, a declaration. But when her fingers came down, the sound that came out was thin. It was correct. Every note was in its right place, the tempo was steady, the dynamics were observed. She moved through the first movement, a part of her brain watching from a distance, narrating, now the arpeggio, now the softer passage, crescendo here, she finished. The final note hung in the silent, judging air of the hall. Then it was gone. At the far end of the room, behind a long wooden table, sat the man who would decide her future, Maestro Valery. He was a legend, a pianist whose recordings she had listened to until the CDs were scratched. In person, he was smaller than she imagined, but his presence filled the space. He had listened with his eyes closed, his face a mask of stone. Now, he opened them and looked at her, not unkindly, but with a terrible, weary certainty. He gestured for her to come closer. She stood from the piano bench, her legs feeling like they were made of sand, and walked the long walk to the table. Her file was open in front of him. Your technique, he began, his voice a low rumble, is admirable. Your fingering is precise. Your dedication is clear in every measure. A tiny, foolish spark of hope flickered in her chest. He sighed, a sound of genuine regret that somehow made what came next worse. He leaned forward, his hands clasped. You play all the notes, young lady. But where is the music? Where is the story, the pain, the struggle, the joy of this piece? I hear a very good machine. The words landed, one by one, like stones. She felt her face grow hot. You have worked very hard, he continued. This is obvious. But to have a career, to truly make it in this world, it requires something else, a fire, a soul that speaks through the keys. I must be honest, for your own good. He paused and looked directly into her eyes, delivering the sentence that would echo for a decade. With this approach, you will never make it with piano, never make it. The words didn't just reject her application, they rewrote her past and cancelled her future. All those years of practice, the calluses on her fingertips, the missed parties, the dream that had been her companion since she first touched a keyboard. At age 5, all of it was declared, by an ultimate authority, a waste. She mumbled a thank you, though for what, she didn't know. She gathered her music, her movements slow and mechanical. The walk out of the hall was a blur. She remembered the heavy door swinging shut behind her with a soft, final thump, sealing away the grand piano and the world it represented. The world outside was jarringly normal. Sunlight, traffic sounds, people laughing. She felt like a ghost moving through it. She didn't go home right away. Instead, she went to the city park and sat on a bench, staring at nothing. The maestro's voice played on a loop in her head. Never make it. Never make it. When she finally did go home, her parents took one look at her face and knew. Her mother hugged her and said, it's just one school. There are other paths, but the words were hollow. They had all aimed for the top, and the top had said no. That night, she looked at her own upright piano, squeezed into the corner of her bedroom. It was no grand concert instrument, but it had been her friend, her confidant. Now, looking at it brought only a sharp, physical pain. The sight of the keys made her feel sick. Every piece of sheet music on the stand seemed to mock her. The dream wasn't just broken. It felt like it had been a lie she told herself. A week later, she made a practical decision, the first of many. She needed a new computer for school, and money was tight. She listed the piano for sale online. When a young family came to collect it, a bright-eyed little girl trailing behind her mother. She felt like she was selling a part of her own body. The men grunted as they maneuvered it down the stairs. The little girl pressed a middle C, giggling at the sound. Then it was gone, leaving a pale, dusty rectangle on the carpet. She filled that space with a cheap desk for her new computer. She packed all her sheet music, the Bach, the Chopin, the Beethoven, into 2 large cardboard boxes and taped them shut. The only thing she kept was a small, wooden metronome. Its casing was scarred from use, its pendulum still. She put it on her bookshelf, a silent monument to what used to be. Life, as it does, moved on. She finished high school. She chose a sensible major in graphic design at a local university. It was creative, people said. It had good job prospects. She learned about color theory and typography, her hands mastering a keyboard of a different sort, clicking and dragging, creating clean, digital images. She was good at it, competent, reliable. After graduation, she got a job at a small marketing firm. She rented a tiny apartment on her own. Her life settled into a predictable rhythm. Wake up, commute, design logos and brochures and website banners according to client briefs, commute home, order takeout, watch some TV, sleep. It was fine. It was stable. There was no terror, no crushing pressure. But there was also no spark. The music that had once been the soundtrack of her life was replaced by the quiet hum of her computer and the distant noise of the city. Sometimes, in quiet moments, a memory would surface. The feeling of her hands solving a complex musical passage. The deep, satisfying resonance of a low chord holding in the air. But it was quickly drowned out by the louder, clearer memory of that voice in the concert hall. Never make it. It became her private truth, a reason for the vague emptiness she sometimes felt. She hadn't been good enough. The dream had been a fantasy. This, the quiet, productive, unremarkable life, was reality. Her bookshelf gathered ordinary things, a few novels, a plant she sometimes forgot to water, a photo of her parents. And there, between a book on design and a forgotten coffee mug, sat the old metronome. Its weighted pendulum was still, frozen in time. It never ticked. It just was, a silent wooden echo of a heartbeat that had stopped long ago. Life, she had learned, had a way of moving you forward even when you felt perfectly still. Years had a habit of stacking up, quietly, like the unread magazines on her coffee table. She went to work. She paid her bills. She met friends for coffees sometimes, and they would talk about relationships, or movies, or the mild annoyances of their jobs. Her world was small, comfortable, and colored in safe, muted tones. The frantic, passionate girl who had trembled before a piano was a story about someone else, a character from a book she'd read long ago and mostly forgotten. The change began, as big changes often do, with a very small favor. A friend from her design course, a woman who was always involved in 3 different community projects at once, called her one Tuesday evening. Her voice was its usual whirlwind of energy. "I'm in a total bind," the friend said. "You know that community center I volunteer with sometimes? St. Bridget's. We're finally clearing out the old storage room tomorrow to turn it into a little computer lab for kids. I promised I'd help sort donations, but my car just died. I've got boxes of books and art supplies in my living room that need to get over there. Any chance you could be an absolute hero and run them over for me? It would take you an hour, tops." She almost said no. She had planned to spend her Saturday morning catching up on a design project, then maybe doing nothing at all. But her friend was genuinely kind and had helped her move into her apartment years before. It was just an hour. "Sure," she heard herself say. "Text me the address." That is how, on a crisp autumn Saturday, she found herself double-parked outside a weathered brick building in a part of the city she rarely visited. A faded sign read St. Bridget's Community Center. It wasn't grand or imposing. It looked tired but stubborn, like an old tree that had weathered many storms. She hauled the boxes of donations from her car, her arms aching slightly, and pushed through the heavy front door. The inside was a warm chaos. The smell of old wood floors and coffee hung in the air. Children's colorful drawings were taped haphazardly to the walls. In one room, a few older people sat playing cards. In another, a young woman was helping a teenager with homework. It was alive in a way her quiet apartment and sleek office were not. A messy, buzzing, human sort of alive. A man emerged from an office, wiping his hands on his jeans. He looked to be in his late 50s, with a kind, lined face and hair that was more gray than brown. He wore a flannel shirt and a look of perpetual mild overwhelm. "You must be the rescue party," he said, a tired smile breaking through. I'm the director here. Let me take those. Your friend said you were coming. Thank you, truly. This stuff is gold to us. He led her down a short hallway stacked with more boxes, towards a door that was slightly ajar. The beast is in here, he said, nodding at the room. The great closet of mystery. We haven't properly looked in here for years. It's just been a catch-all. If you can just start making piles, keep, toss, maybe sell, that would be incredible. No pressure to finish. Whatever you can do is a help. He left her there, in the doorway of a room that was less a room and more a cave of forgotten things. A single, dim bulb hung from the ceiling. Boxes were stacked precariously. There were old folding chairs, a broken lamp, stacks of outdated magazines. The air was thick with the scent of dust and old paper. She rolled up her sleeves. A practical decision. She would do this one useful thing and then go home to her orderly life. She started with the nearest box. It was full of mismatched coffee mugs. She set it in the keep pile. The next box held winter coats, musty but still serviceable. Keep, in our past. She had created some order from the chaos, the floor space slowly emerging. Her back ached from bending. As she moved, a heavy box marked missed decorations. Something caught her eye behind it. It wasn't another box. It was a shape, tall and angular, covered with a faded, floral-patterned bedsheet that had gathered a thick coat of gray dust. Curious. She grabbed a corner of the sheet and tugged. It came away in a cloud of dust that made her cough and wave a hand in front of her face. As the dust settled, she saw it. A piano dot. It was a baby grand, or it had been one, long ago. Now it was a sorry sight. The dark wood was scratched and dull, like an old blackboard that had never been cleaned. One of its elegant, curved legs was completely broken, splinted together, with what looked like a broom handle and a truly excessive amount of duct tape. The brass of the pedals was green with tarnish. The lid was closed, hiding the keys. She stood very still. The busy sounds of the center, the distant laugh of a child, the murmur of voices seemed to fade away. It was just her and this silent, broken creature in the dusty half-light. She hadn't touched a piano in over 10 years. Not really. She'd walked past them in hotel lobbies, seen them in movies. The feeling was always the same. A tightness in her chest, a quick look away, followed by the old, familiar mantra in her head. Asterisk, never make it, asterisk, but here, in this dusty closet, with no one to see or judge. The feeling was different. This wasn't a concert instrument on a stage. This was a castaway, abandoned and forgotten. It was more like looking at a wounded animal than an object of terror. Slowly, almost without her mind commanding it, her hand reached out. Her fingers brushed the cool, dusty wood of the fall board, the cover that protected the keys. With a gentle press, she lifted it. It creaked in protest. The keys were there. Ivory ones, now yellowed with age, like old teeth. Some had small chips. They were waiting. Her heart was beating hard again. But it wasn't the sickening panic of the audition. This was something else. A nervous curiosity. A pull. She looked over her shoulder. The hallway was empty. She was alone. Hesitantly, she pulled out the dusty bench that was tucked underneath and sat down. It wobbled on uneven legs. She brushed the dust from a few of the keys with her sleeve. Then, taking a breath that felt like the first real breath she'd taken in that room, she pressed down on middle C. The sound that came out was nothing like the clean, pure tone of her old upright, or the mighty roar of the conservatory's grand. It was muffled, soft. The note was flat, slightly out of tune with itself, a little sad. It didn't ring out. It kind of asterisk thud ded asterisk into the dusty air and stayed there, warm and imperfect. But it was a sound, a real, physical vibration that traveled from the key, up her finger, and into her bones. She pressed another key, then another, a simple, broken chord. The mechanism was sticky. Some notes didn't sound at all. It was terrible. It was beautiful. It was the most honest sound she'd heard in years. She didn't play a piece. She couldn't have. Her fingers were stiff, strangers to the landscape. She just touched the keys, listening to the whispers that came back, each one a little different, each one flawed. She didn't know how long she sat there, exploring the ghost of an instrument. The crunch of footsteps on dust made her jump. The director was in the doorway, holding 2 mugs of tea. He didn't look surprised. He just leaned against the doorframe and smiled. Found the old relic, huh? He said, handing her a mug. Came with the building when we took it over. The story is some old church donated it decades ago. Been sitting here ever since. A shame, really. She took the tea, her hands warming around the ceramic. It's out of tune, she said, stating the obvious. He laughed, a short, genuine sound. That's one word for it. It's a museum piece. We were just going to see if anyone would haul it away for scrap. The word scrap hit her with a surprising force. No, she said, the word coming out quicker than she intended. She softened her voice. I mean, it's still a piano. Maybe it could be fixed. A little. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the dust on her clothes and the new light in her eyes. He took a sip of his tea. You know about pianos? The old instinct rose up. No, not really. Not anymore. But looking at the sad, taped-together leg, she couldn't say it. I used to, she whispered. He was quiet for a moment, studying the instrument. Tell you what, he said, his tone shifting to practical. This room is going to be a computer lab. We need it cleared. If you can somehow get this old thing into a playable state, and I mean just so it doesn't scare the kids, you can keep it here. Play it whenever you want. This place, it could use some music, even if it's a little off-key. He gave her a final nod and left, closing the door partway behind him, leaving her in the dim, dusty silence with the piano in her pounding heart. She looked at the keys. She looked at the duct tape splint. A strange, impossible thought was forming in her mind. It wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about making it. It was about fixing something. About seeing if this forgotten thing, and perhaps the forgotten part of herself that had responded to its call, could make any sound at all besides a sad, flat thud. She finished her tea, set the mug down carefully on the floor, and lifted her hands back to the yellowed keys. This time, she didn't just press one. She tried to remember the shape of a C major scale. Her fingers fumbled, clumsy and unsure. The notes that came out were a mess, a jumble of out-of-tune sounds. But for the first time in over a decade, she was smiling. The decision to return to the community center felt less like a choice, and more like a magnetic pull. In the days after her discovery, the quiet order of her apartment seemed different. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, like something was missing. Her mind kept wandering back to the dusty closet, to the muffled thud of that middle C. It was a problem that needed solving, a broken thing that asked, quietly, to be fixed. She went back the next Saturday, armed not with music, but with supplies. A bucket of warm, soapy water, soft cloths, a small toolkit she'd bought from a hardware store. Feeling like an imposter among the screws and wrenches, the director Leo, he'd told her to call him, simply nodded when he saw her, as if he'd expected her all along. He handed her the key to the storage room, now just called the piano room, and left her to it. The work was slow and physical. It had nothing to do with artistry. She started by gently cleaning decades of grime from the wood, watching as a deep, rich mahogany began to emerge from under the gray. She learned the names of the parts, the fall board, the keybed, the pin block. She watched online videos of technicians, her laptop propped on a box, following instructions on how to safely clean the keys with a mild soap, careful not to let any moisture seep into the cracks. The yellowed ivory would never be white again, but it slowly lost its grimminess, becoming a soft, antique cream. The broken leg was the biggest challenge. The broomstick and duct tape were a temporary disaster. She found a quiet, older man who came to the center for the warm lunch program, a retired carpenter. She showed him the leg, her face flushed with the awkwardness of asking for help. He clicked his tongue, examined it, and said, "Needs a proper splint and glue, clamps. We can do that, together, over 2 afternoons." They carefully glued and reinforced the ancient wood. It wasn't pretty, but it was strong. The piano no longer listed to one side like a sinking ship. It stood, firmly and proudly, on its own 3 feet. This was the easy part. The tuning was a different world. She ordered a basic tuning kit online, a lever, some mutes, a tuning app on her phone. The first time she inserted the lever onto a tuning pin and tried to turn it, the sound it made was a terrifying, sharp crack. She yanked her hand away, hard hammering, convinced she had snapped a string and ruined everything. But the string held. The sound was just the protest of a pin that hadn't moved in 30 years. She realized she couldn't tune it, not really. It was too far gone for her clumsy beginner's attempts. But she could explore it. She could gently work on a few notes in the middle, listening through the app, learning the feel of how a tiny turn could sharpen or flatten a sound. She wasn't making it perfect. She was making it different, making it hers. And then, one evening, after she'd cleaned the last key and the room smelled of lemon soap and old wood, she sat down to play. Not to practice, just to see what it sounded like now. Her hands hovered. The ghost of the concert hall drifted in. She could almost hear the cold pronouncement. Asterisk, where is the music? Asterisk, she shook her head, physically, as if to clear it. There was no judge here. There was only dust motes dancing in the late afternoon sun streaming through the high window. There was only this kindly, broken down piano that she had washed and glued back together. She started with a simple 5-finger exercise, the first thing she'd ever learned. The notes were still out of tune with each other, but they were clearer now, less muffled. They had a character, a strange, plunky sweetness. The stiffness in her fingers was immense. It was like trying to write with the wrong hand. But she kept going, slowly, the movements awkward and hesitant. She didn't plan to start visiting at night. It just happened. Her design job could be draining, filled with client revisions and pixel-perfect demands. One particularly frustrating Tuesday, instead of going home to stare at her own walls, she found herself driving to St. Bridget's. Leo had given her the code to the back door. The center was closed, dark and silent out in the absolute quiet. The piano room felt like a secret world. She flipped on the single bulb. The piano waited. She sat, and this time, she didn't play exercises. She let her hands fall onto the keys in a cluster of sounded discordant, messy chord. It wasn't music, it was a sigh, a release of the day's tension. She did it again, finding a different combination of notes. It was a conversation without words. The piano spoke back in its off-key voice, and she answered with another chord, night after night. It became her ritual, her secret communion. She began to revisit pieces from her old life, but with a completely new goal. She wasn't trying to perform them. She was trying to understand them. Why did this chord here always make her sad? Why did this run of notes feel like a sudden burst of light? She played them painfully slowly, correcting mistakes without frustration, because there was no one to hear them. The metronome's tyranny was over. She let the phrases breathe at their own pace. One night, she dug out a simple sonatina by Clementi, a piece she had played with robotic precision as a child. She started it, her fingers remembering the patterns more easily now. Halfway through, she stumbled on a passage she'd always hated, a tricky turn of the wrist. Before, she would have forced her way through, angry at her clumsiness. Now, she stopped. She played just those 4 notes, over and over, slowly. She listened to how they connected. She experimented with the different fingering she found online. And then, like a knot loosening, it flowed. A laugh bubbled out of her, a sound of pure, surprised joy that echoed in the empty room. It wasn't a perfect performance, but it was a solution, a small, personal victory. She began to notice the piano's personality. The high notes were a little bright and tinny. The low notes were a warm, fuzzy rumble. The middle C, her first note, now sounded clearer than the others, a little proud. She started to play those quirks, not against them. She found a piece by Seti that suited the piano's dreamy, imperfect sound. As she played, she wasn't thinking about technique. She was picturing the dust motes dancing. She was feeling the long day leave her shoulders. The fear didn't vanish. Sometimes, when she played something that began to sound too beautiful, too fluid, the old critic's voice would whisper, "Who do you think you are?" But now, she had an answer. She wasn't a pianist trying to make it. She was just a person, in a room, having a conversation with an old friend. The voice would fade, drowned out by the next phrase, by the very real, physical act of making sound. One Thursday, she was so lost in this world that she didn't hear the soft footsteps. A small shadow appeared in the doorway. It was a boy, maybe 8 years old, one of the kids who came for the after-school program. He was holding a half-eaten apple, his eyes wide. She stopped playing, her hands freezing. "That's the broken piano," the boy said. Faculty. She smiled. "The spell broken, but not unpleasantly." "It is, but it still talks. Can I try?" he asked. A part of her wanted to say no, to protect this private space. But she saw the curiosity on his face, the same pull she had felt. She slid off the bench. "Sure, gently, though. It's old." He climbed up, his legs dangling. He pressed a single key with a sticky finger. The note rang out. He grinned, a gap-toothed smile, and pressed another. Then he smashed his whole hand down in a glorious, chaotic crash. She winced, but he laughed. "It's loud." "It can be," she said, laughing with him. He played for another minute, a symphony of smashes and single notes, then hopped down, his curiosity satisfied. "Bye," he called, Running back down the hall, she sat back down. The silence he left behind was different. It wasn't just her secret anymore. The music, such as it was, had touched another person. However briefly, it had been a shared thing. She looked at her hands, resting on the imperfect keys. They were no longer the stiff, fearful hands from the storage closet. They were stronger, more sure. They were the hands that had cleaned and glued and slowly, patiently, learned to speak again. The piano was no longer a monument to a failed dream. It was an instrument, and she, for the first time in her life, was not just a player following instructions. She was simply someone who played. The rhythm of her secret nights at the piano became the steady, unseen heartbeat of her life. Her days were still filled with color palettes and client emails, but they now felt like the surface of a lake. Underneath, in the quiet depths, was the music. She didn't talk about it with anyone. It was too fragile, too new, a shy green shoot breaking through hard-packed earth. She feared that speaking about it might make it vanish, or worse, turn it back into something that could be measured and judged. Leo, the director, never pried, but he noticed. He'd hear the faint, off-key strains of a melody drifting down the hall as he locked up his office. He'd see the new light bulb she'd installed in the piano room, and the clean, patched-up leg of the old instrument. One afternoon, as she was leaving, he stopped her, holding a flyer. "We're trying to drum up some community spirit," he said, handing it to her. The paper was cheaply printed. St. Bridget's first open mic night. It read, "Music, poetry, stories, all welcome, free coffee. It's next Friday," Leo said. His tone was casual, but his eyes were kind and serious. "We need people to just be here. Show the neighborhood this place is alive." "I was thinking," he paused, scratching his temple, "that piano sounds a whole lot better than it used to. Maybe you could play a piece, just one. Something simple, for the center." The paper in her hand felt like it weighed 100 pounds. The open, peaceful feeling she carried from her practice vanished, replaced by a cold, familiar dread. It slithered up from her stomach. An audience, however small, however friendly, it was a stage, and stages were where dreams went to be pronounced dead. "Oh, I couldn't," she said, the words tumbling out too fast. "I just tinker. I don't perform." "It's not a performance," Leo said gently. "It's just sharing. Look, half the folks who come will be the regulars from our senior lunch, just happy for a night out. The other half might be parents waiting for their kids to finish drama club. They're not critics, they're just people. The piano needs to be heard, after all this time. And," he added, his voice dropping, "I think maybe you do, too." He walked away, leaving her standing there, the flyer buzzing in her hand. The old voice was back, loud and clear. "You'll never make it. You lack the soul." It would be humiliation. It would prove, once and for all, that the piece she'd found was just a private delusion. But then she thought of the piano, its patiently cleaned keys, its wobbly bench, its brave, tuneless voice that had spoken to her when she had been silent for so long. It had sat in the dark for decades. Leo was right. It deserved to be heard, not judged, heard. For the next week, she was torn in two. One part of her, the practical survivor, was screaming to call Leo and cancel. The other part, the newer, quieter part that had grown in the dusty room, began to prepare. She knew instantly what she would play, if she played. Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor asterisk. It was a piece she had mastered technically as a teenager, playing every note with icy precision for a scholarship committee. She had not played it since. It was a piece about loneliness, about longing. Back then, she hadn't understood it at all. Now, she felt she'd lived it. The night arrived. She dressed simply, her hands clammy. The community hall at St. Bridget's had been transformed. Folding chairs were set up in uneven rows, about 30 of them. A few strings of fairy lights were tacked to the walls, doing their best to fight the grim fluorescent overheads. A small table held a large coffee urn and a plate of store-bought cookies. It was the furthest thing from a concert hall imaginable. The audience trickled in. There was Mrs. Gable from the knitting group, smiling warmly. A few teenagers hovered near the back, looking at their phones. A man who often came in for a warm place to sleep sat in the front row, his hands folded neatly in his lap. A handful of parents with young children, and, in the very back, an older woman with a kind, watchful face, her silver hair swept up neatly. She was a friend of Leo's, a retired music teacher who volunteered with the book drive. No one noticed her. Leo acted as the host, his voice warm and encouraging. A teenager played a pop song on a guitar. his voice cracking with nerves. A young woman read a poem about her grandmother. There was supportive, unpolished applause after each one. Then Leo said, "Next, we have a friend of the center who's been bringing our old piano back to life. She's going to share a piece with us." Her walk to the piano felt like the longest walk of her life. The wobbly bench seemed to wobble more. The single overhead light felt harsh. She could feel every pair of eyes. The ghost of Maestro Valerie sat in the back. She was sure of it. His arms crossed. She placed her hands on the keys. They were cold. Her mind went blank. The opening notes of the nocturne, which she had practiced 100 times this week, vanished. Panic, pure and white, seized her throat. Then she looked down. She saw a small, sticky smudge on middle C, probably from the little boy who liked to crash the keys. She saw the faint scar on the wood where the leg had been glued. This wasn't a perfect instrument. This was her piano, the one she had rescued, and which had, in its way, rescued her back. She took a breath, not to steady her nerves for a performance, but to say hello to an old friend. She let her fingers fall. The first notes were hesitant, softer than she'd planned. The piano's familiar corks were there, the slightly bright high note, the fuzzy bass. But as the melody unfolded, something shifted. She wasn't thinking about her fingers, or the audience, or the past. She was thinking about the quiet despair of those years without music, the loneliness of the storage closet, the first surprised joy of a clean chord, the late-night peace, when the notes felt like they were knitting her back together. The music began to breathe. It wasn't perfect, a note wavered, a transition was clumsy, but the emotion behind it was naked and true. The sorrowful passages held the weight of a decade of silence. The brief, soaring moments of hope shone with the quiet triumph of a repaired leg, a cleaned key, a forgotten joy rediscovered. She wasn't playing Chopin's Nocturne anymore. She was playing her own. The piano sang along with her, its imperfect voice the perfect vessel for a story of broken things made whole. If only for a moment. In the back, the retired music teacher, Mrs. Almeida, sat very still. She had heard this piece performed by conservatory students in recital halls with perfect acoustics. She had heard it played fast and flawless, and often, sadly, empty. What she was hearing now was different. It was slow. It was vulnerable. It had pauses that weren't written on the page, spaces where you could feel the player remembering how to feel. It was not a demonstration of skill. It was a confession, a release, a soul, finally speaking through the keys. Not because it was perfect, but because it had something to say. As the final, resigned notes faded into the warm, still air of the room, there was a complete silence. It lasted a second, two. It was the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full. Then, the man in the front row, the one who came in for warmth, slowly began to clap. It was a solid, steady sound. Then Mrs. Gable joined, dabbing her eyes with the tissue. Then the teenagers, then the parents, until the room was filled with a wave of applause that was louder, warmer, and more real than any she had ever heard. She stood, her legs shaky, and gave a small, awkward bow, not to the audience, but to the piano. She touched its lid gently before walking back to her seat, her heart pounding not with fear, but with a strange, overwhelming fullness. She didn't see Mrs. Almeida approach Leo, her eyes bright. She didn't hear the older woman whisper, "Who is that? I need to speak with her." All she felt was the lingering vibration of the music in her hands, and the warmth of the applause that wasn't for a flawless performance, but for a shared, human moment. The curse had not been broken by perfection. It had been washed away by something much simpler, and much more powerful. The sound of a soul, finally heard. The applause settled around her like warm confetti, a feeling so unfamiliar it was almost dizzying. She made her way back to her folding chair, her legs feeling unsteady, and sat down. People were smiling at her, a few giving little nods. The man from the front row leaned over and said, "That was real pretty. Thank you." His words were simple, but they landed deep. She just nodded, a lump in her throat, unable to speak. She didn't notice the silver-haired woman speaking intently with Leo in the corner. She was too busy feeling the quiet echo of the music still humming in her bones. The fear was gone, replaced by a profound and weary peace. She had done it, not for a scholarship or a critic, but for the piano, for Leo, for this room. That was enough. The open midnight wound down. People lingered over the last of the coffee, chatting in small groups. As she was putting on her coat, Leo caught her arm gently. His face was animated. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," he said, leading her towards the back. The older woman was waiting, her hands clasped, her eyes bright and intelligent. "This is my friend," Leo said. "She used to teach music, long time ago. Writes for the community paper sometimes." The woman extended a hand. Her grip was firm, her skin papery. "That was extraordinary," she said, her voice low and clear. "I've heard that piece performed many, many times. In concert halls. By students with fingers far faster than yours." The old familiar flinch started in her chest. A preparation for the blow. But the woman's eyes held no criticism, only a kind of awe. "I have never," the woman continued, "heard it lived like that. You weren't playing Chopin. You were telling us a story. Your story. I could hear it in the spaces between the notes." She paused, studying her face. "What happened? Where did that feeling come from?" It was the first time anyone had ever asked. The story, haltingly, began to tumble out. Not the whole story, but pieces of it. The conservatory, the cold pronouncement, the sold piano, the dusty closet, the cleaning, the gluing, the quiet nights of rediscovery. She spoke not as a victim, but as someone describing a long, slow walk in the dark, and the surprising moment she found a door. The woman, Mrs. Almeida, listened without interrupting. When she finished, Leo was beaming. Mrs. Almeida simply said, "You've given that old wreck of a piano its soul back, and it's given you yours." A week later, a short article appeared in the local paper's arts section. It wasn't on the front page. It was tucked near the back, next to the gardening tips. The headline read, "Broken Piano, Mended Spirit, Music Finds a Home at St. Bridget's." It wasn't a review. It was a story. Mrs. Almeida had written about the center, about the forgotten piano, and about the woman who had found her voice again, not in pursuit of fame, but in the act of repair and community. There was no grandiose language. It was plain, honest, and human. The article didn't make her famous. It didn't lead to a record deal or a concert tour, but it did something else. A few people in the neighborhood read it and dropped off donations at the center. Old music books, a check for $50, a local piano tuner, a gruff man with kind eyes, read it and showed up one afternoon. "Heard about your project," he grunted. For the cost of materials alone, he spent 3 hours properly tuning the old baby grand. For the first time in likely half a century, the piano sang in harmony with itself. The notes were clear, sweet, and still full of its unique, warm character. It was no longer a ghost. It was fully alive. The biggest change, however, was internal. The final, rusty chain of the old curse had snapped. The words "you'll never make it" had lost their power because she had finally understood what making it meant. It didn't mean standing on a stage under blinding lights. It meant sitting on a wobbly bench in a room full of peace. It meant a child laugh at a crashing chord. It meant the grateful nod from a lonely man in the front row. One afternoon, she was playing a gentle, easy piece when she heard a small shuffle at the door. It was the little boy who liked to crash the keys, with his friend, a girl with big, serious eyes. "Can you teach us that?" the girl asked, pointing at the piano. She stopped playing. The question hung in the air. Teach? She wasn't a teacher. She wasn't a maestro. She was just. But then she looked at their faces, full of the same curiosity that had drawn her into the storage closet. She thought of all the locked doors a simple scale could unlock. She thought of the sanctuary this room had become for her. "I can try," she said. She started with one student, then two. Leo, seeing the spark, helped her apply for a small community grant. To her shock, they got it. A tiny sum of money to start a proper, free music program at St. Bridget's. They bought beginner books. They fixed more chairs. Now, her evenings at the center had a new rhythm. She still came alone sometimes, to play for herself, to get lost in the music that was now a conversation, not a struggle. But other nights, the room was filled with the sounds of hesitant scales, wrong notes, and sudden, triumphant little melodies. She didn't teach them to be perfect. She taught them to listen. She taught them that a mistake was just a different sound, not a disaster. She told them the story of their piano, and their eyes would go wide. One day, she brought the old metronome from her bookshelf at home. She placed it on top of the piano. She showed the children how to wind it, how to set the pendulum swinging. They watched, mesmerized, as it began to tick. Tick, tock, tick, tock. A steady, patient heartbeat filling the room. She realized, watching the pendulum swing, that this was the life the metronome had been waiting for. Not to measure frantic practice for a judgment that would never come, but to mark the steady, joyful rhythm of a new beginning. Her life outside the center didn't change dramatically. She still worked her design job. She still lived in her small apartment. But the color had seeped back into her world. The work felt more bearable because she knew what waited for her at the end of the day. The silence in her apartment was no longer heavy, because it was just a pause between the rich sounds of her real life. She had finally made it with piano, not as a soloist, but as a guide, not as a star, but as a keeper of a flame. She had made it to a place where music was not about fear, but about connection, not about a single, perfect performance, but about the daily, imperfect act of showing up and sharing a piece of your heart. The piano at St. Bridget's, once a silent monument to forgotten things, was now rarely silent. It spoke in the laughter of children, in the slow, determined practice of a teenager, and in the quiet, soulful pieces she would play when the center was dark and still. It had changed everything, not by making her famous, but by making her whole. And in making her whole, it had given her a way to help others find their own song, one clumsy, beautiful note at a time. The melody of her life was no longer a solo. It was a duet and then a chorus, growing stronger and more beautiful with every new voice that joined in.